the newsagents.
Perhaps it's Boris Johnson that's morally repugnant and not me, I don't know. Can you see the nonsense of all of this? And let's be clear, this man will go down as the worst Prime Minister of modern times, a man who betrayed an 80-seat majority. Who opened the door to mass immigration? Boris Johnson. Who betrayed the will of Brexit voters? It was Boris Johnson. He pretended to be a Conservative, but he governed as a Green.
This election campaign has thrown up a few surprises. D-Day, Fluttergate, launching in the rain. But who had it on their card that we would see Nigel Farage at war with Boris Johnson and the Daily Mail?
There are three strange bedfellows in today's episode. And today we're going to be asking why they have all turned against each other and what the result might be in this election. Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis. I was enjoying the when you said about the three bedfellows who turned on each other in this election. I thought you were going to finally reveal all the deep enmity that there is between the three of us. But no, it's good we've got someone else.
We're not going to reveal that.
No, well, it's too
or
late.
the fact that we were all in bed together last night.
The size of that bed.
Very strange.
Very strange indeed. But I did do a double take when I saw yesterday the vitriolic attack from Nigel Farage on the ghastly Daily Mail, and then Richard Tice piling in saying it's almost the enemy of the people and cannot be trusted in this country, and that I've instructed lawyers Peter Carter-Ruck to get involved because of what the Daily Mail has published about me. And you thought, oh my God, what's going on the right of British politics when Nigel Farage now regards a newspaper that has been his cheerleader as the enemy?
Yeah, we should explain the context for this, because what it's revealing this week is what a thin skin the Reform leader has. He made remarks to Nick Robinson on the BBC in a Panorama interview last weekend, which suggested that he held the expansion of NATO to blame, in part, for Putin's war on Ukraine.
And the expansion of the EU.
And he says that he had long held these views, and in fact he has voiced many of these views about the sort of shape of NATO before. I think he called the expansion of NATO a provocation. And it immediately drew fire from the party leaders because he has, I think, often been seen as something of a Putin apologist, a man who has repeatedly appeared on Russia Today, the state TV station, a man who didn't seem to call out Putin as the warmonger that, you know, most of this country think he is. And Nigel Farage was left in this slightly odd place, which is trying to sell himself as the ultimate British national figure, you know, the man who supports D-Day, the man who supports the veterans, the man who supports our boys overseas, and yet found himself on the wrong side of the Russian dictator. And today he kind of doubled down again in another interview with ITV. And I think this was Farage's way back. He found that the Mail had been attacking him, and he's tried to bring Boris Johnson into this whole argument by saying, well, Boris Johnson did the same thing as me. He did it, you know, in 2016. He's been holding up a paper. And so now you've got this sort of circular firing squad where Farage and the Mail are at each other's throats. And now Boris Johnson, who we thought was actually a kind of a version of Farage in his own way for the Conservative Party, is now on the firing line too.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing about this is that so Farage makes those comments to Robinson, which, Emily, as you described, as you say, actually nothing new. He's said this many times before. The interesting thing, everyone leaps on it, I think rightly in lots of ways. But the interesting thing about what Farage then does next as a piece of news and management, which I think is very revealing about him and his team, is that they don't choose to play it down. They don't choose to just try and move on. They actually doubled down, initially with a piece in the Telegraph where he wrote, "Don't blame me for telling the truth about Putin's war in Ukraine. The invasion of Ukraine," he said, "was immoral, outrageous and indefensible. As a champion of national sovereignty, I believe Putin was entirely wrong to invade the sovereign nation of Ukraine." But that doesn't change the fact that I saw it coming a decade ago, warning it was coming, and I'm one of the few political figures who've been consistently right, very Farage's line, and honest about Russia's Ukraine war. If you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised if he responds. That then leads to this BBC story, which there is, where Zelensky's office doesn't comment directly about what Farage has said, but does quote a source in the presidential office warning about the virus of Putinism and the rise of war propaganda, saying the task of civilised humanity is to fight this virus in the bud. That is what leads to the Daily Mail headline, which directly links those comments to Farage personally. And this is what has so incensed Farage and his team, because they are saying that the Mail is, quotes, committing election interference, interesting phrase, election interference, by drawing an explicit link between what Zelensky's office is saying and Farage, and they're saying, in fact, they didn't do that. It was just an unnamed source, and it wasn't directly about Farage himself.
Well, this is where Farage is becoming more like Donald Trump with each passing day, citing election interference. He cited election interference, or Reform cited election interference, over Luke Trill's last More in Common poll that we had on the newsagents.
The Daily Mail, Zelensky and Luke Trill, the big three.
The big three. I mean, and you just think this is slightly nuts. And to your point, Emily, the thin-skinned nature of Nigel Farage when facing criticism. And I think there has been a fundamental miscalculation on Farage's part, which is to do the Trumpian thing, which is to double down, which is to say election interference. I'm sorry, at the closest, we are 3,000 miles nearer to Ukraine than the eastern seaboard of the United States of America. It seems much more real. It seemed much more clear that there was an invasion taking place that was unprovoked. And the fact of the matter is that when those countries came out of totalitarian rule at the end of the Soviet Union, it wasn't expansionism where the EU was trying to take them over. Those countries wanted to join the European Union to have a bulwark of democracy, the rule of law, free elections like we have in the West.
Yeah, look,
that was the driving force.
NATO, if you want to go back, NATO has expanded, I think, 12 times or so since, the 1950s and 2004 and 2009, after the sort of end of the Cold War. 2019, I think, was North Macedonia. They started talking about accession for other countries then as well. But you've talked about the criticism that Farage doesn't like. And I think it's important to also say that he has received compliments, actually, for what he said, for showing enlightenment and sanity. And that has come from, just checking notes, from Russia state media. So they've been very, very happy that he has actually put the record straight on this one. I mean, look, I think two things are possible. If you want to have a very intense discussion about the expansion of NATO and about the position, that is a separate one. But I don't get the sense that this is what Farage is doing here. I think, as you said, he's trying to get the UK into the same place as MAGA Republicans are for Trump, which is starting to soften the ground for, do we really want to spend taxpayers' money on foreign wars? And the truth is that in America, which is very far away from Ukraine, it works. Here, I think people feel intensely the sense of loyalty to Ukraine. And actually, to be fair, Boris Johnson took on that cause and really pushed Britain to the top of being the Ukraine ally.
And just one other point on all of this is that when we went to Clacton a couple of weeks ago for the launch of Nigel Farage's campaign, and he stood on that bar table and he made the speech about how, the fact of the decline of Britain could be seen in that people weren't venerating the heroes of D-Day and aiming at Rishi Sunak and all the rest of it. Look, he doesn't talk about what D-Day was about, which was about to stop the spread of Nazism, to stop the spread of nationalism across Europe. Fascism. The sort of things that he is now saying, well, don't poke the Russian bear. Should we have poked the Nazi bear when it was going into the Sudetenland and Poland? I just think that Nigel Farage is very selective in the bits of history he wants to teach us.
But I think that there are separate things going on here, right? Because he could say, and it is interesting, I do think this is notable and interesting because it is the first time that a major British political figure has contested the consensus which has basically existed across politics, and that includes Labour, Conservative, SNP, Lib Dem, right across, which is basically that British support for Ukraine should be unequivocal and full-throated. Because although Farage is not saying explicitly that we should withdraw support, it is the logical corollary of what he's saying. He is the only major British political figure who's basically saying that the war in Ukraine is at a stalemate. Now, the guy wants to be Prime Minister, right? That's what he says. So if he thinks that the war is at a stalemate, it logically implies that our military support should be lessened. I think that the thing is, he might find himself on slightly more fertile ground arguing that than the territory in which he is choosing to fight, which is basically to stick to the line that it was EU and NATO expansionism which provoked the war in Ukraine. And although there will be some people who might argue and have argued that expansionism is an indirect cause, what it does is to shift the burden of culpability onto the EU and onto NATO and onto those sovereign states. Because the point I don't think Farage is reckoning with is the point that you've alluded to, John, which is that ultimately, and Farage sort of acknowledges himself in that in his piece, the biggest supporter of state sovereignty is supposed to be Nigel Farage, right? He believes in national sovereignty. I've never understood the Putin apologism or the sort of defence of what has happened in one sense, which is that it always undermines and fails to acknowledge the state sovereignty of all of those Eastern European states. And frankly, if Ukraine had joined NATO and had been allowed to accede, I mean, who knows what would have happened, but it's certainly true to say that they would be in a different position today. And if those countries, Poland and the Eastern European states, weren't in NATO today, would Russian tanks be in Tallinn, Riga and Warsaw?
Look,
it's entirely credible to believe
to
so.
clarify it, he said he has not defended President Putin and he would not defend President Putin. So I think you can see from that actually he is at a crossroads of what he's actually trying to say here. I don't think he knows, and I think it goes back to your point, which is that it's all very well standing on a soapbox and sort of declaring things. As soon as you're interrogated, as soon as you actually sit down and have to explain your policies to somebody one-on-one in a lengthy interview situation, you unravel pretty quickly.
But I think it's more than that with Farage. I think he cannot retreat from his own positions. So that is the rigidity.
Well,
of him
he's
as a political
doubled
figure.
down, but also he's added this extra line, which is that he's not defending. So,
Well, to be fair, he would say in his own line that he has never defended Putin personally. He's just acknowledged.
Can I
Except
just pick up on this? May seem a really semantic point, but you were talking about expansionism. Has the EU and NATO expanded? Yes. Did they have an expansionist policy? No. The fact that we've now got Finland and Sweden in NATO
but
is a direct consequence.
arguably after the Ukraine war, of
yeah,
course.
it's a direct consequence. They have asked to join.
No, you could say, I think, when the wall fell after 89, of course it expanded because it took in all those Soviet satellite countries that were then not protected. I mean, that they were
Sovereign
free.
free will.
And Putin did see that as a humiliation. There's no doubt about that. He saw the Soviet, Putin thought that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster, and he saw these former Soviet states joining the West, and he and other members of the former Soviet elite thought it was a humiliation. Okay, he did think that. But it doesn't naturally follow from that he has the right, or indeed that he's provoked, to invade other countries to try and compensate.
I think part of the problem is that Farage, his top line is basically they're all the same. Therefore, QED, he has to sound like he's not the same, and therefore he has to say something different, even if it's something that is actually not going to make life particularly easy for him and the Mail. And I do want to get onto this position of the Daily Mail, because the Mail have really championed the idea of a Tory who is more Tory than any Tory you've ever seen before, right? Nigel Farage has been the epitome of their right-wing Tory for so long, precisely because he wasn't in power. And now I think there's that sense they're suddenly getting cold feet. They're suddenly thinking, what are we doing? He's great. We all know he's great for copy. He's great to get people clicking. He's great to get your column shown. But does the Mail really want to be the paper that puts Farage right at the centre of British political life? And I think they're having absolute cold feet about that.
Well,
now.
this is the thing, right? The Mail and other right-wing newspapers have long found Farage to be a very useful tool, an instrument, and it's been a very mutually profitable relationship between the two sides, because they've wanted to see on all manner of issues the Conservative Party move to a position to the right that Farage has embodied, right? And that's been fine, and it's happened again and again,
but
particularly
within the system of a Conservative Party. That's the difference.
But not to the point which they now fear, and which I know Farage's team, they think that the reason that they have gone, the Mail has gone for Farage in this way, is because Rothermere and the owners of the Mail and others are terrified that the Daily Mail is terrified the Conservative Party is going to be destroyed. And what they don't want is for the happy Farage to be the tool, to be the instrument to get what they want, but they don't want Farage to be the end point of British right-wing politics.
He's meant to be the catalyst. He's not meant to be the solution.
But then you've got the question that arises from exactly that analysis, which is an awful lot of Conservatives on the right were thinking that some sort of rapprochement between Boris Johnson and Nigel Farage is the future of conservatism. And now they are at each other's throats about who is more morally degenerate than each other. Mirror,
it's just
mirror, on the wall.
It's a great question, isn't it, to be asking the population who is more morally repugnant, Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson?
Exactly. And so you've now got a situation where who is going to come to the rescue of the right of the Conservative Party at the end of it? And the question I've been mulling over the past few days is Nigel Farage the flame that the Conservative moths flutter towards? Or is he the moth that flutters towards the Conservative Party? And it's very hard to see either going near each other now as a result of this.
Because the big picture, I guess if you step back, is that the Mail and Boris Johnson and Farage can all be part of, as I said, the circular firing squad. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is being asked questions about which Taylor Swift song he likes. I mean, if there is a genie, it is working overtime for Keir Starmer right now. You could not have aligned the stars better for this election campaign than to have the three people that you might have most feared all at each other's throats, leaving you clear entry to appear with superstars chatting about the lyrics of a song. I mean, you could not make that up.
I am the genie. I grant you 3 wishes, Sir Keir. Well, 1, I'd have the Tory party campaign falling to pieces. 2, I'd have Nigel Farage entering the race and causing ructions within the Conservative Party. And 3, I guess, Scotland going out of the Euros early, so there's no feel-good factor in Scotland that might help the SNP.
He'd never say
Just
that.
Just between him and the genie.
And that's before you get onto the betting scandal. That's before you get onto, any of the other
Prime
stuff.
Minister insulting D-Day veterans.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, well, but I think the net result of what's happened, right, is I think twofold in terms of Ukraine and Farage's choice to go to war over it in a way that he could have just tried to calm it down. One is, as you say, John, the prospect of any kind of longer-term rapprochement between Farage and Johnson is now much less than it was. You can feel that even with the members of the Conservative Party who are on the right of the Conservative Party who have actually wanted Farage to come in, it feels, as of now, and this could change, it feels that becomes less likely because of this wedge issue. Although, for people like Liz Truss, who have been endorsing Trump and so on, it has long been the case that if you dance with these sorts of people, we've all known that they're very, very pro-Putin by comparison, or very, very sort of anti the Ukraine war.
I mean, that alignment now works better. Truss and Farage actually works quite well.
Well, yeah, but she claims to be, very, very anti-Putin and so on. It's always sort of, never made much sense. But in terms of the dynamics of the election campaign, the Conservatives think that they have finally found a wedge issue that they can beat Farage with time and time again. Because, as you say, Emily, there is a disconnect between whatever you think about Farage's position, whether you think it's right or wrong. There is no doubt that it is not a popular one with the British public, and it is not a deeply contested one as it has become in, say, the United States. And the problem with Farage, and actually, the thing is, Farage, I mean, as you know, I think Farage is a very potent political force, but he does have weaknesses that have not been exploited. And one, for example, is, I mean, in terms of his connection with his electorate, actually, there is a big disconnect. Another example would be, say, with the NHS. He is someone who basically believes the NHS should be privatised, or at least it should be fundamentally reformed. Most of his older, socially conservative, more statist voters who are not libertarian like he is, there is a disconnect.
Look,
there.
If you look
so
at
there are political difficulties.
If you look at what his manifesto is promising on tax cuts, it benefits the top, the £70,000 earner much more than it does benefit those at the lower end of the scale.
He's not Maloney. He's not Maloney, right? He's not a winning, absolutely...
I mean, it's not really populist at all in the sense that he is definitely seeing a way of making tax cuts for the rich. It's further to the right than Rishi Sunak is that level.
When you have a populist who has a number of positions which are in fact not popular, that is difficult.
So, Lewis, you said it was a wedge issue. Now that the Conservatives have got between Farage, where they can attack him, do they pile resources into Clacton now and say this is a man who's a Putin apologist?
Too late.
Yeah, I think so. Do you just let it go and think
they should have? What they should have done, I think, they should have put somebody who they really thought could change minds. You know, somebody who would really have given him a run for his money in Clacton. Giles Watling, you know, bless him, I don't think was ever going to be that person. But I do think one of the things that Farage
I'd love
is doing...
to see Boris go to Clacton to make it the one constituency he goes to try to support the Conservative. I mean, it would just make the fight fascinating.
Why would he? I mean,
yeah,
you
he's
know,
not going to.
But I think the point about Farage and Johnson actually comes back to Brexit as much as anything, which is that Farage is deeply uncomfortable with this idea that, having called himself the architect of Brexit, he is now also responsible
Saddled
for
with it.
Brexit. Yeah. And so he has to keep reminding people, in inverted commas, that Boris Johnson was the one that delivered bad Brexit and Nigel Farage was the one that got the potential for good Brexit. And actually, you know, within that, there's a whole multitude of lies and dissembling and all the rest of it. I don't remember Nigel Farage ever spelling out to any of the electorate what Brexit would involve and how much it would cost and how much it would dampen our ability to trade and export and import and all the rest of it. So there is definitely a complicity in both those positions. But right now, Farage has got to be the one that pushes Brexit blame onto Boris Johnson because Brexit has fallen out of fashion, even with those who believed in it so strongly.
And the thing is with Mail Story, I mean, I can understand in one sense why Farage and his team, they are livid about it, because it is true to say that it is a leap, the headline, by comparison to the actual story. It is. But then on the other hand, you know, call that.
It was ever thus. I'm sorry, but
yeah, exactly.
Hello.
Oh, I can't
Who are we
believe
talking about?
I mean, clutching my pearls. I can't believe what a tabloid newspaper's done.
Well, indeed. I mean, if we're going to call that election interference, then we can say that the Daily Mail and other, you know, right-wing newspapers have been interfering in elections since forever. I mean, you know, Farage in his very unusual video last night that he put out. I mean, he was making comparisons with the Zinoviev letter of 1924, you know, which is when the sort of newspapers basically tried to suggest the Labour government at that time were a bunch of communists. You know, and this is sometimes the weakness with Farage, which is that he can very easily end up falling into a trap of being so aggrieved, you know, because he has a politics of grievance and he constantly says that he is being persecuted or attacked, or there is a special sort of sense of persecution against him. It can actually become a problem in terms of achieving his political aims, because he ends up just fighting
all this
war.
is the Trump playbook. It's all, the grievance, the sense of it being rigged,
You
the
can
sense
only
of being
have so
under
many
attack.
enemies.
Well, you know, it works for Trump in America. Let's see. You know, let's see what happens in November. But it has worked for Trump in America. I'm not sure that the British character is there. I'm not sure that we like self-victimisation.
But we're also
as
not
much.
as polarised. I mean, that's the other thing. I think something has happened to Farage, which is that, I mean, he's always had a sense of this, but I think his politics, and we've talked about it before, because I think he spent so much time with Trump, his politics has become more aggressive, that sense of grievance has become more acute, that sense of persecution has become stronger.
Yeah, woe is me is not very British.
And it, as you say, Emily, it works in the United States because you've basically got 45 to 50% of the population who are going to give you a hearing, come what may, because things are so polarised.
Because it's a main party. It's a mainstream party.
That is not the case here.
Yeah,
it's a different political setup, and I think in terms of his strategy for the election, this is a mistake.
And also, the other thing to say about Donald Trump is there are times when he doesn't double down. There are times when he knows he's got to retreat, when he's gone too far. Funnily enough,
you mean when
Putin,
they write the autocue for him?
Well, Putin, his visit to Helsinki, and he said, I've got no reason to disbelieve what Putin has said to me, and then reversed it the next day when there was a Republican backlash over the overturning of Roe versus Wade. He's not quite as bullish about it now as he was, because he knows it's hurting him among female voters. There are times when Trump has the agility to think, I need to change my position, and Farage hasn't got there yet. If you were listening to us yesterday, you would have heard Lewis, Emily and I discussing whether it should be Gamblegate, betting shop gate. But you've got a new one, Maitlis.
The Gambleshambles.
Gambleshambles, I love that.
Gambleshambles, Gambleshambles.
Except,
is that too much
in
of
a
a
way,
mouthful?
people don't like this because it makes light of something that I think a lot of voters will just hear as corruption.
I also had someone from Flutter, the gambling organisation, get in touch saying, please don't coin Fluttergate. Quite worried about that.
But again, this story has now been running for nearly 2 weeks of the election campaign, with Rishi Sunak.
Let's say a third of
the campaign.
2 weeks now.
Right?
Wow, God.
It's just astonishing, isn't it? Which starts off as a minor thing, potentially involving one rogue little element in the Conservative Party, a candidate standing in, wherever, and it has grown, and hasn't stopped growing. And Rishi Sunak is still being asked about it.
Well, it's important to remember that the Gambling Commission investigations are independent. I don't have the details of those. They don't obviously report to me. But what I can tell you is we have been in parallel conducting our own internal inquiries and will, of course, act on any relevant findings or information.
I don't have the details. Please do not give me the details. Nobody tell me anything. Craig Williams...
Hang on, sorry, I thought the whole reason the Conservative Party couldn't say anything about it was the Gambling Commission inquiry, and Rishi Sunak has just said they're conducting their own inquiry.
It's almost like it makes no sense at all, isn't it?
It doesn't, because Craig Williams is the one who said, I made a terrible judgment of error, right? So
error of judgment.
Both.
So, I made a terrible error of
Both,
judgment. But you can just imagine Rishi going, don't say that for Christ's sake. And then he's asked, well, what was the error? Well, I'm not going to... I can't talk about that. Well, I'm not going to talk about that. But you did make an error. Yeah, of judgment. Yeah.
I mean, again, talk about news management. I mean, talk about an absolute failure of news management. I mean, it was so obvious yesterday. We played some of the clips yesterday from James Cleverly. Again this morning with Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, doing, I mean, I want to say an indecent fist, making an indecent fist of already a bad hand.
We want an indecent fist on this programme,
okay. I would prefer my fist indecent. I don't know about you.
Okay, I'm going to try and get this podcast back
on its feet.
Back on its feet. Thank you.
But I mean, doing a lamentable job really of defending the position. But then again, the position makes no sense at all. Like, it was so obvious even by this morning, by the time Sunak finally spoke about it, that the line that Number 10 were asking ministers to go around and put out yesterday and today would have to be changed. Because both politically and logically it was absurd. Because, as you say, Emily...
I love the logic. As soon as you think about it, it just falls apart.
It falls apart instantly. We're waiting for the Gambling Commission, but the guy's already accepted and confessed that he did it
make
as the Prime Minister. And all it requires is the Prime Minister to ask any of the people
One phone
involved...
call.
Sorry, the very angry Prime Minister.
A very, very angry Prime Minister. But this Prime Minister is so angry that he hasn't even thought to make 1 or 2 or 3 phone calls.
And he doesn't know any of the details.
And then they hide behind the Gambling Commission, but the Gambling Commission clearly is completely separate and is not going to instruct the Prime Minister how to deal with his own staff.
The Gambling Commission probably doesn't work to an electoral timetable either, I'm guessing.
No, and it's not going to take them very long.
But if Rishi Sunak has announced that he said they're conducting their own inquiry, then it's legitimate tomorrow or the day after to say, so what have you found? Yeah. What have you found out, Rishi? Can you tell us? Did they? Didn't they? It's an astonishing piece of electoral kind of, I don't know, malpractice almost.
Just to put this into a different context, if it was allegations of sexual assault, for example, you can assume that person would be suspended before...
Pending
an investigation.
That's what always happens.
Peter Bone, suspended, right? Scott Benton, lobbying, suspended. So is it particular to gambling, or is it particular to being 10 days out from an election that means he's taken no action with the people that he knows are involved?
But the failure to suspend means we're going to keep on asking, are you still supporting those candidates? Do you still support, are you telling Conservative voters to go and vote for them?
Indeed. I mean, in Montgomeryshire, what should Conservative voters do? Should Conservative voters actually vote for this guy? Is he going to be a Conservative MP? If he makes it to the House of Commons, is he going to have the Conservative whip? They don't know. No one knows. Because the line is that we're just going to wait until such time as the Gambling Commission complete their work. Or something that is actually, in many ways, completely separate to the considerations the Prime Minister has to make. Because what he's making is a moral and ethical judgment. The Gambling Commission are potentially making legal judgments.
I think this is one of those issues with cut-through. We were talking about it upstairs. There is so much stuff that happens in an election that nobody normal ever registers or notices. And I think there have been 2 absolute cut-through points in this election. D-Day, which we know people talked about in your focus groups. It's the stuff that comes back on the doorstep. And I think gambling is the other one because it is so relatable to so many people. It's quite simply a question of fairness. And there will even be people, dare I suggest, who defend, a handsy, inappropriate, sexually assaulting MP because they'll say, we didn't hear both sides of the story. We just don't know what went on. We don't know what the relationship was. It's amazing how many people will actually defend somebody in that position. But I think when it comes to gambling and that person has put the bet on...
improperly.
Well, I mean, the improperly is the allegation,
yeah.
right? But when you know that the bet has been placed, I think it cuts through to people because it is such an ordinary, everyday gesture that a million people, you know, you listen to somebody saying, what would you do if you could go back in time? Oh, do you know what I'd do? I'd put, 100 quid on the results of the 1966 World Cup, right? That's what everyone says. It's that sense of being able to beat the system because it's in your fantasy dreams. And here somebody has actually done it in reality.
But it is the single most toxic thing for the Conservative Party, that sense that there is one rule for them and one rule for the rest of us. And we go down the bookies and we take our chances whether our horse comes in at 2-1 or 20-1, and we've got no idea.
It's about the sense of being ordinary and in the lap of the gods, right?
Yeah. Whereas it feels like when they go to bet, the tables are in their favour and they know they're going to win.
This is why Conservative candidates up and down the country are furious about it.
Of course.
They're furious about it because every time the campaign tries to turn a corner, look, this last 10 days from a Conservative, there are no big announcements to come now. There are no big announcements to come. We've got one big set-piece event, which is the head-to-head
debate. Not even the launch
debate.
of the Scottish Manifesto in Scotland.
Well, I think
Which we've just had today.
Let's put the national events, UK-wide events. Something that's going to get the entire country looking at it. Right? The manifestos are out. National manifestos are out. There's one big debate to come, and after that, really, at this point in the campaign, it's just about hammering your message time and time again. The consequence of being at this stage of the campaign means that there is not that much news, there's not much diary news, plan news, and so something like this will just dominate the news agenda day after day after day until it's dealt with. And then this is why, as we were saying yesterday, it leads one to suspect or wonder, no evidence for this, but at least people will wonder whether there may be anybody else involved that either the Conservative Party knows about, or Number 10 involved.
Names that we've heard of.
Names that we've heard of, someone more prominent still. Because as things stand at the moment, in order for the Tories to have had any chance in this campaign, they had to make incremental gains over each and every week on subtle ways, as they were sort of doing in week one, actually, over national service and so on. Just incrementally.
It's funny that you're now holding that up as a good.
Well, that was, I think, week one was
right?
because it was aimed at Tory Reform voters. They were dominating the news agenda day by day while the Labour Party had candidate problems. But that's the thing, this campaign has got worse and worse and worse with each week, and it needed to get better and better and better. We now know from the polls, it's a piece out today, the Tories have lost a third of their support this year. Right? That is the rate of political attrition that they are experiencing. And I'm sorry, Rishi Sunak is often... people say, he had a terrible hand, none of this is his fault. Yeah, he did have a terrible hand. I think it was always going to be difficult. His political incompetence is profound, and he's demonstrated it again and again and again, including in this campaign. He does have a lot of blame at his door.
You talk about there being no other national events, and I think it's worth remembering that actually the final TV head-to-head is on Wednesday night, which will be exactly a week after debate where he said, I'm very, very angry about Gamblegate. All you have to do is say, so... How's that anger coming along?
It's going to dominate
what have
that
you done?
as well.
Right?
Yeah.
So if nothing happens between now and that Wednesday night, then all you get is a man who has been so angered that he's taken absolutely no moves to rectify anything.
Where is he? This is the thing.
He's in Scotland.
He's in Scotland today.
He's in Scotland,
but I
his
have to say,
manifesto
don't you
launched.
think that, as a prime ministerial figure, he has been quite ghostly in this campaign by comparison to... Starmer's been everywhere, right? I mean, and this isn't just me saying this. I mean, Tim Montgomery, for example, was saying it the other day. Lots of Conservatives are saying it, that the prime minister, by comparison to someone who is leading a campaign, has not exactly been ubiquitous in a way that they normally are. He should take control, and he hasn't done so.
I tell you, one of the things that has surprised me, which has actually helped Rishi Sunak a little bit, is that I've heard from various different people in different broadcasting organisations that when Sunak has come in to do a question and answer or whatever it happens to be, he has left really angry, really petulant, unpleasant to whoever the presenter's been or the production team have been.
Why has that helped him?
Well, because it hasn't come out yet.
Oh, I see what you mean.
Because no one has reported it. But there are
You
stories...
just ruined that, haven't you?
Well, there are stories circulating apparently about him being in pretty foul temper after he hasn't got the questions he's wanted.
I bet next Thursday cannot come soon enough for him.
Right, so John has trailed our gaffometer, which I feel should have some sort of sound effects, actually, some 70s sound.
Come on! I want the production team to think of what.
Okay, right. I'm going to leave a space for them to put one in.
What about ours?
Me. I like mine.
Yours, I feel, was a little low tech.
Oh,
Little low tech. Yeah.
Do you want me to turn it
even
into
for
a song?
the 70s?
I could turn it into a song.
Right, let's move away from this. So the gaffometer, right? So this is something that our election partners More in Common have come up with, and it's basically a poll which they've done. They did this last weekend, and it measures how much cut through a particular story, usually a bad story, gaff, has had, and how badly it reflects on the party. So there are, and all the three worst ones by far are basically what we've been talking about. So D-Day, by far the worst. So 85% of the population aware of it, and 80% think it reflects badly on the party. Gamblegate is at 75%, which, considering it's quite new, again, bad. And then it goes down a bit, but Sky TV is the third. So these are all...
The Sky TV being the comment where he said, "What did you lack as a child?"
Yeah, exactly. So these are all... Two of those are direct Rishi Sunak responsibilities. The third one, Gamblegate, is not concerning him directly, but it does concern how the guy has handled it. So, again, it supports exactly what we were saying, which is, this is a campaign which has been... There are no Labour stories at all anywhere approaching any of that. The closest is Diane Abbott.
Yeah, I think that is relevant as well, because the Diane Abbott shenanigan, whether she was in or out or in or out, I think if he had been the incumbent, that would have been incredibly damaging as a story. And I also think the whole question about whether he thought that Corbyn would have been better with Boris and why did you support him and all the rest of it came out of Beth Rigby's interview on Sky. I also think that would have had cut through. I think the difficulty is with all this stuff is people's perception of what is damaging. And it is asymmetric at the moment. People are more ready to think of the Conservative Party as screwing up, making the biggest gaffes, because they have already decided in their minds that that's the narrative of this election. I do think that's relevant, because I think Starmer can make gaffes and can be more easily forgiven because he is not the incumbent here.
I think that's right. And I think, as ever in our sort of vibes-based politics, success breeds success and failure breeds failure, and it is about perception. And for example, something that is on here but is much lower down, which is Emily Thornberry basically suggesting that the Labour policy on VAT, private schools, or private schools being having VAT applied to their places, would lead to bigger class size. If they had been in government, our Labour were doing badly, that would have been a bigger story and there would have been more focus on it and more people would have recognised it. But I think that what that shows as well is that Rishi Sunak and his team would know that. They know that anything they do or any mistakes they make,
they're going to be held to a high standard.
And so that means that their news management had to be on point week after week after week. And it just hasn't been. It's been lamentable.
Over D-Day, we said, what about the advisors? Surely they could have told him differently, etc., etc., etc. Everything I've heard about Rishi when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, and I've heard this from extremely senior civil servants who work very closely with him, was that there was a control freakery around Rishi Sunak where he wanted to do what he wanted to do. Interestingly, one of the things that was said to me was that Rishi Sunak could never see the point of being abroad, and so when he was Chancellor and it was the IMF spring meeting in Washington, he would always want to be on the first plane home and never stick around any longer than he had to. And you suddenly see with D-Day exactly how that translates. But it doesn't work to blame the campaign officials at Conservative Party HQ if you have got a control freak Prime Minister who thinks he knows best about what to do with the time.
One thing I'd say is that somebody who feels insecure in their position as leader does not want to be out of their country for a long time. I mean, we know that coups happen when you're out, when your back is turned. So it actually, I think, speaks to a sense of how precarious maybe he feels within the Conservative Party as a whole or within his position as leader. And we know that there have been rumblings, right? I mean, nothing's happened this campaign, but there have definitely been rumblings. That to me sort of speaks volumes, that you want to be at the centre of things as quickly as you can.
Very much the opposite to the John Sopel approach, isn't it? You're first playing out, last playing back.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Oh, do I have to go now? Right, see you at the airport.
I've got 3 more ambassadors.
Yes.
2 more Secretary Generals.
3. Yeah.
Anyway, if you've been listening, thank you, and I hope you've moved on from the terrible image of 3 in a bed, Maitlis,
or the
Sopel,
indecent
of
fist.
Goodall, or
With
the
the
indecent fist.
Stop it. We're going now. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.